Good morning. We're privileged to have as our next speaker Dr. Bertha Madras, who is the author of the World Health Organization report on cannabis. She is also a former Deputy Director in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, and she also holds over 19 patents. One of her patents has been called one of 25 technology innovations that has changed the world. She's received numerous awards and has delivered over 250 presentations all over the world. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Madras.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for showing up on a Friday morning, but it's raining, so maybe that's an incentive to be indoors. We are a nation at crossroads. We are divided. We are divided on the marijuana issue. Social scientists, politicians, the public, the press, and those supporting liberal legal access to marijuana weigh the evidence on the values and the harms in their unique way. On the other hand, there are people in public health and public health policy and scientists, and they are at the intersection of this debate from a different perspective. So I'd just like to begin by giving a disclosure of recent, most of these are nonprofits, but some of them are, and I'd like to emphasize that the world is also at a crossroads with regard to this issue. California is, and what are you? What stand do you have? The opponents and advocates of marijuana legalization recently weighed in on their reasons for it. The opponents say that it's dangerous to the individual, it's dangerous to youth, it's addictive, and it's dangerous to society. The proponents say that they support legalization primarily because of its medicinal benefits. So the strategy for promoting marijuana as a medicine has worked to normalize and in general to make the drug appear harmless. So what is the status in the US now? California led the way with Proposition 215 in the mid-1990s. We now have 4 states that are legal. We have medical marijuana in a number of states, and we have others that still remain where the drug remains illegal. If this change sweeps across the nation, we're going to have unknown consequences. In 2016, this is what the United States faces. It faces the issue of what to do about marijuana in ballot initiatives and legislative initiatives. We have a growing movement to make hallucinogens as medicines, and that is beginning to push the boundaries on that class of drugs as well. We have new psychoactive substances which are daunting in terms of regulation, and of course we have the opiate problem, and all of these are interrelated. And essentially what is happening is that this is a movement amongst very dedicated proponents to legalize all drugs. The problem is that the opponents of marijuana lean on the science that says the evidence is mounting almost weekly, monthly, yearly that marijuana is unsafe. In fact, most of the data that I'm presenting to you today comes from data published by others in this past year. Only some of them are August of 2016. The advocates claim that marijuana is safe, it's harmless, it's beneficial. And this is the dilemma that we're in. Certainly California has been the leading edge of this social movement. There have been 3 recent marijuana rulings that are relevant to this debate. The 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in September of this year had a 3-0 decision that upheld the federal ban on gun sales to medical marijuana cardholders as reasonable because the use of marijuana and such drugs raises the risk of irrational or unpredictable behavior with which gun use should not be associated. The federal court in the Eastern District of California in 2015 ruled that marijuana should remain in Schedule 1. And the US government, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, and NIDA, all weighed in August, just this past month, that on whether or not marijuana should remain in Schedule 1, the most restrictive schedule without medicinal use. And so we come to this crossroads, what to do about it. Is it only a plant? What about marijuana biology? Let's use the court case to see what the reasoning was behind maintaining marijuana in Schedule 1. And the court case did become a template for creating the World Health Organization report on the medicinal uses of marijuana. So we're going to try to address these questions. Is marijuana medicine? Does it have abuse liability? Is it addictive? Is it effective? Is it safe? Because these are the issues that go into scheduling a drug in the most restrictive scheduling. So the one thing we often hear is that it's only a plant. But plants can be toxic. Oleander, strychnine, beautiful plants, flowering plants, deadly plants. This is a study that was done with tomato leaves sprayed with cocaine. Without cocaine, the larva came along and ate it very avidly and walked away. Sprayed with cocaine, they came along, and eventually a lot of them died within 24 hours. The same experiment has been applied to spraying the plant with an extract of marijuana with the same results. So I want you to memorize this entire list of deadly plants that can be toxic and that can kill. And it's a very simple issue. Plants don't have teeth, they don't have legs, they don't have arms, they can't run away from danger. So a number of them produce toxins. Toxins so that they will stay alive. That's their way of fending off predators. Some don't. That's why we eat them. And if we were talking today about celery instead of marijuana, there would be no discussion. We just go and eat our California salads with some lemon poppy dressing, although you test positive for opiates. But the reason that marijuana is so important and on our radar screen is because it affects the nervous system. So let's discuss marijuana biology very quickly. And I will note to Patrick Vanier that I started 4 minutes late, so I will consume my 4 minutes. Endocannabinoids, marijuana biology. The marijuana plant contains over 700 known chemicals, but its full chemistry is still not defined. Tetrahydrocannabinol, delta 9, is the highest concentration. People often say, what does delta 9 mean? It means there's a double bond between 2 carbons in one of the 3 rings. There's over 104 cannabinoids made by the marijuana plant as of this date. The number keeps increasing yearly as the analytical tools become more sophisticated. Synthetic cannabinoids made by chemists, medicinal chemists, are thousands. There are thousands in the literature, and some of them have been converted to K2 and spice. And the endocannabinoids are made by the brain and the body. Now, the top 2, THC and cannabidiol, which has received a lot of interest lately because of its potential as an anti-seizure medication. These are made by Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. The bottom two are made by the brain, anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. Anybody who has vision that can see the screen can see that their structures are very different. Those differences are the heart of why a chemical such as THC can produce toxic effects in the brain, and why anandamide and 2-AG don't, because they're produced by the brain and they're natural. The endocannabinoids are present all over the body. The CB1, the cannabinoid receptor, the target, is in brain and heart, pancreas, muscle, testes, ovaries, uterus, prostate gland, vascular tissue. The CB2 receptor, blood cells, immune cells, and so on and so forth. And that's why so many claims for the medicinal purposes are based on a little bit of knowledge, but not a lot. Because if they're all over the place, they can cure or alleviate anything. The marijuana. Marilyn Huestis yesterday gave you a very quick overview of how marijuana affects the brain. I'm not going to reiterate what she said, just to tell you, to emphasize, that can affect hormones, appetite and sex, motor control and planning, the prediction of reward, emotion, anxiety, fear, the higher brain functions, learning and memory, and motor control and coordination, vomiting and pain. Now, how does marijuana affect brain communication? We all know how we communicate. We communicate by sending verbal messages, electronic messages, written messages, or hand signals. And I challenge each one of you to look to the person on your right and ask them to stand up. If you don't use a hand gesture, and you don't communicate verbally, or don't pass them a note, how will they know? Let's try it. Tell the person next to you to stand up, but don't move. Don't use hand gestures. Nothing. Not possible. So how does the brain do it? The brain does it by sending chemical messages in very discrete packets from one nerve cell to another, very carefully controlled and regulated. And within a millisecond, the signal is gone. Because if it wasn't gone, I couldn't go on to the next sentence. I couldn't move my hands from this position to this position. Marijuana, smoked, ingested, a number of ways, comes in unregulated to the fluid bathing nerve cells, and it sledgehammers the targets of your own chemical communications at unregulated amounts. It binds differently because the structure is different, and it sends abnormal signals throughout the brain. Communication is the heart and soul of our problems with all drugs, because every single drug affects this type of communication in the brain. Then we just move on to one final question on marijuana, and that is, does it kill? We hear often it's safe because opioids kill and marijuana doesn't. And that's accurate. This is the distribution of the CB1 receptors in the brain stem, the area that controls heart rate and breathing. And what you can see is that other than the nucleus tractus solitarius, there's almost there's almost no cannabinoid receptor. And the NTS is a part of the brainstem that controls nausea. The distribution of the opioid receptor, you can see it glaringly. Tons of it in the area that controls heart rate and breathing. And so opioids can sledgehammer that area of the brain and cause a person to stop breathing, and the heart fails and the body fails. So marijuana doesn't kill. One is very unlikely to die of a marijuana overdose, but it affects perception, judgment, coordination, and these are fundamental properties of the human brain. And anything that affects that can be risky to the individual. So marijuana as a medicine, as I said, this is the bridgehead. This is the way that marijuana became normalized increasingly in this country, because there were advocates, proponents that said it is a medicine. Let's dissect this according to federal law. The court case in the Eastern District of California, the testimony phase, and the decision. So what is the court case? Government, the federal government, the DEA, the FDA, and NIDA schedule drugs according to 5 schedules. Schedule 1, the most restrictive, and I'll define it in a moment. Marijuana is there along with ecstasy and peyote and psilocybin and methadone and methylene dioxypyrovalerone and heroin and LSD. Schedule 2 are drugs with very high abuse potential and medical uses. Schedule 3, medical uses, lower abuse potential. Schedule 4, low abuse potential medical uses. And Schedule 5, the lowest abuse potential. A substance does not need to be listed as a controlled substance to be treated as a Schedule 1 substance for prosecution. So there were, I believe, about 14 individuals in 2011 who were arrested for a massive marijuana grow, over 1,000 plants at federal land in northeastern California. After prosecuting a number, there were 6 left, and the defense case became a national case, because they said marijuana does not belong in the most restrictive category, Schedule 1. They didn't petition the court to reschedule, but to reclassify marijuana into no schedule. Harmless, not dangerous, just an over-the-counter, a food product, whatever. But witnesses for the defense kept referring to bringing it to Schedule 2, so I must emphasize that. If the federal judge ruled that marijuana is no longer a controlled substance, the court would decriminalize it. The defendant's charge would be dismissed, and if the law is unconstitutional, it would be legal and void and cannot be the cause of punishment. This was the courtroom taken from the web. There was a lot of 15,000 web pages on this case. Judge Kimberly Mueller, defense attorney Zena Gill, the defendants, U.S. Assistant Attorneys Richard Bender and Greg Broderick. And I have to point out that the person who drew me made my nails look like talons. And anybody who knows me and knows I've worked most of my life in a lab, you never have long nails in a lab. You can't do the fine dissections or the pipetting with long nails. I've never had them. But they decided to add a little note of belligerence to me. These are the photographs of the key players, and there were 9 lawyers involved. So what was the case based on? For a drug to be in Schedule 1, it has to have a high abuse potential, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use as a drug under medical supervision. Those are the 3 criteria for a Schedule 1 drug. The testimony phase. High abuse potential. How is abuse defined? Use amounts that creates a health or safety hazard. Diversion from legitimate drug channels. Use contrary to medical advice. Actions similar to other drugs with abuse potential, creating hazards to health and community, and so on. What did the defense claim? Abuse and addiction of marijuana is minor. High abuse potential, the first claim. Then on redirect, they said moderate. They disagreed with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, which was put out by the national experts on substance use disorders. Chuck O'Brien, Deb Hassine, Wilson Compton, and so on. The word addiction is confusing. Is it a moral issue? Is it a disease? The risks of marijuana addiction is disputed in the medical and scientific world. Researchers rate addiction far below tobacco, alcohol, caffeine. Only 9% of experimenters become addicted, so it has low abuse potential. 1994 data, dating back to when marijuana was very low potency. Socioeconomic status and cultural differences likely affect whether or not people become abused. And there's no marijuana withdrawal. What did the government say? The government was me, because they had 7 expert witnesses and I was the only one for the US government. Currently, 6 million people have a cannabis use disorder. And let's break it down. The old data from James Anthony, 1994, is about 9 to 10% of people who use progress to addiction. The latest data from Deb Hassine has that 30.5% of current users fulfill the criteria for substance use disorder. 30.5%. We don't know why. She doesn't know why. But one of the possibilities is that people are using more frequently, far more users who are using daily, and also the potency is increasing. The teens, much higher proportions, the 1 in 6 as compared to the 1 in 10, and daily users, around 30, 25, depends on who you read, 25 to 50% can become addicted. So let's talk about the DSM-5 criteria. I'm going to use Zach. Zach is a child who, real person, real teenager living in San Francisco. And this was published in a journal with his direct words. Began using in grade 7, smoked every few weeks, then once a week, and then used daily. And 2 months later, smoked every morning before going to school. One of the criteria, use larger amounts for longer periods. By 9th grade, I couldn't get to school without smoking. I couldn't eat or sleep without smoking. Excessive time spent using. Doing everything seemed to make it like drugs weren't affecting me in a bad way. He developed tolerance to some of the effects, which you do after a while. I tried to quit. I would try and I'd feel so absolutely lousy. I'll paraphrase him. But for 5 or 6 days, and then after that I said, okay, I feel so bad, I'm going to smoke anyway. Experience withdrawal and used to stop withdrawal. None of the negative things are getting any better. Continue to use despite problems. Smoke for a week, forget about wanting to quit for a month, and I would quit again and the same thing would happen. Repeated efforts to quit or cut down. Near midnight, the San Francisco Police Department called. Zach had been arrested for public intoxication. He was walking in a bad neighborhood, found bloody, He couldn't find his car. He had no memory of being hit in the face. He used in hazardous conditions. And then he concludes in his own words, it literally ruins everything else in your life because nothing else is fun. Important activities reduced or given up. What about withdrawal? The pharmacology of withdrawal is specific to marijuana. It's not a global thing. You can stop the withdrawal by re-administering marijuana. Regular users, about 33% feel withdrawal. Heavy users, about 50 to 95% manifest withdrawal. Relief by marijuana or similar substances. The distress or impaired social and occupational function. Worse treatment outcomes if they have a serious withdrawal, have difficulty quitting. And adolescents, 4 symptoms of withdrawal predict a very severe problem after a year. And what are these? Irritability, anger or aggression, nervousness, sleep difficulty, decreased appetite, weight loss, restlessness, depressed mood, physical significant discomfort, stomach pain, shakiness, tremors, sweating, fever, chills. The first 6 are the same withdrawal symptoms as cocaine, because cocaine does not have a physiological withdrawal like alcohol or opioids. The others look a little bit more like opioids. And we won't be able to talk about that nexus, but there is a nexus. So, Schedule 1. I think we have good evidence that there is a high abuse potential. No currently accepted medical use in the United States. This is the first evidence in archaeological history that marijuana was used, physical evidence. A 14-year-old girl died of childbirth, breech delivery, her pelvis was 7 to 7.5 centimeters. She should have had 9 centimeters. She couldn't deliver. Beside her abdomen were ashes. And those ashes were confiscated by a chemist, rushed to his lab, and he found delta-6 tetrahydrocannabinol in the ashes. We know that this happened 1,600 years ago because Roman coins with the photograph of the emperor were found in her grave. And the ashes proved that they were burning marijuana near her abdomen, not to relieve pain most likely, but to promote contractions, uterine contractions, because that's what the ancient Egyptians did. 1,600 years ago, we fast forward to the late 1700s to the present. Pure products began to be isolated from plants, digitalis, atropine, aspirin, quinine. The advantage, they were purified and defined to treat specific illnesses, to understand how they work. They were in controlled and consistent doses, and variations were produced by chemists to make them better and safer with less side effects. And then we began first with this unfettered chemistry to the dawning of public protection. The Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Any drug containing alcohol, cocaine, heroin, morphine, cannabis had to be labeled. The strength and purity had to be, they were unknown. There was no testing. But people had to become aware. So it was to educate and inform the public. But it was weak. It was a very weak act. And in 1938, by 1938, diabetes was treated by Banbar, a weak concoction that killed people. The infections, sulfonylamides, the sulfa drugs were given to children to treat bacterial infections with antifreeze in them. And kids died. And so became the Food, Drug, Cosmetics Act was born in 1938 to protect the public. And they evolved gradually, increasing criteria. And then came the Controlled Substances Act. Because in 1973, it became obvious that psychoactive plants, which can affect brain function, can produce medications, cocaine, morphine, amphetamine, THC. They can produce medications, but they have to be regulated because the brain is the most significant organ in our body, and anything that affects brain function has a particular hazard to people. So by 1992, the criteria for putting a medicine into the Controlled Substance Act, there were 5 points. The drug's chemistry must be known. There must be adequate evidence of safety, of effectiveness. Qualified experts must accept the drug, and the scientific evidence must be widely available. In the medical dispensaries in California, where's the scientific evidence for gummy bears, and for butane hash oil, and for 16% THC? You won't find it in the literature. So the defense said, oh, the chemistry of marijuana is known. The whole plant is complex, but we have, good understanding of cannabinoids, a little bit more to be known. It's remarkably well known. It's highly reproducible compared to even legal drugs. It's the most studied plant in the history of the world. This was the marijuana grow that triggered the court case. I don't have a photograph here, but I would really include someday a photograph of what a clean pharmaceutical facility looks like. The government said the chemistry, quality control, what are the variables? Soil, water, temperature, bacteria, viruses, animal waste, insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, insects, toxic chemicals, active compounds, heavy metals. We don't know what's being sold. There's no regulation. And there's no correlation between that and specific medical conditions. The potency of THC is rising with implications for driving, addiction, toxicity, and psychosis. This is the medicines: White Widow, Ingrid, Super Diesel. Different concentrations of THC, without really considering that the ratio of THC is climbing, even though THC and CBD have completely different effects in the brain and the body. THC is rewarding, produces a high, CBD doesn't. It's intoxicating, CBD is not. It impairs thinking, CBD does not. THC can produce anxiety in some people. CBD opposes that anxiety. THC can produce psychosis. CBD is antipsychotic. THC can be pro-seizure or anti-seizure. CBD is anticonvulsant. The targets of THC and CBD in the brain are quite different. And there's no evidence that CBD is addictive. There's strong evidence for marijuana. Then came the effective medicine component. The defense said there are many randomized controlled trials for efficacy for many more medical conditions than typically required for FDA approval. There's more scientific studies related to marijuana, 20,000, than to acetaminophen, dextromethorphan, ibuprofen, otherwise known as Tylenol, and cough syrup and Motrin. And then they said there's significant therapeutic potential as an antiemetic, appetite stimulant, and analgesic for multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injuries, Tourette's, and so on and so forth. So the government said, let's look at the medical marijuana bills in Arizona. Cancer, glaucoma, HIV, AIDS, Hep C, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, I won't list all of them. In California, these are the conditions, all proposed as compassionate care, whereas now 95% of many of the states, the cards are given to people who complain of chronic pain. We don't see a lot of AIDS, we don't see a lot of cancer, we don't see a lot of cachexia, wasting, we don't see a lot of epilepsy, we see chronic pain, which many of you are aware that unless you have a cut, a fracture, surgery, it's very hard to detect objectively if a person has pain. The poster child is Illinois with 40. Now, I've dug the literature completely. There isn't a shred of evidence, not even a shred of one publication for 90% of the ones in Illinois. So, after looking at all the literature, the conclusion was insufficient clinical evidence for Alzheimer's, for ALS, for cachexia. There are small sample sizes. This is whole plant marijuana, not isolated cannabinoids, not pure cannabinoids, not cannabinoids with fixed doses that have gone through. For smoked marijuana, the evidence is insufficient or non-existent for almost every single condition. And now I want you to memorize all the meta-analyses. These are papers that took all the literature. These are people who excavated. I didn't have a team, I was the Lone Ranger. But these people have 2 or 3 research assistants to go through every single shred of literature from the beginning of time. And they looked at dementia, neurological diseases, MS, psychiatric disorders, epilepsy, cancer therapy, chronic pain, arthritis, and in none of them could I find advocacy for whole plant marijuana for any of these. So, cannabinoids, the adverse events. There are more adverse events associated with cannabinoids and more dropouts than placebo or treatments that are approved for the same medical conditions. In 41 studies, dizziness reported. These are cannabinoids plus or marijuana. Dry mouth, nausea, euphoria, somnolence, fatigue, vomiting, diarrhea, drowsiness, and so on and so forth. So side effects, if you notice, a lot of current literature on smoked marijuana or vaporize does not really dig into the side effects in an effective way. And California's Center for Medical Cannabis Research, the CMCR, we can discuss that if people want to know a little bit more about their data. The FDA has approved cannabinoids, dronabinol or Marinol, for weight loss and AIDS, nausea with cancer chemotherapy, Nabilone, same. Syndros, which was just approved, it's an oral solution. People have said to me, but Marinol is 100% THC. Why are you worried about 90% in butane hash oil or in some of these extracts? And there's a huge, anybody who asks that question needs 5 seconds worth of pharmacology instruction. 90% or 100% THC is the starting data. The next is how much THC is in there. Let's say you have a liquid with 90% sugar. But how much sugar is there in it? Is it 5 grains? Is it 10 cups of sugar? the medical THC that's approved is 2.5 to 10 milligrams per day on average in that 100% THC. What I've calculated is that most of these high concentrates have 50, 100, 200 milligrams of THC. So they both may be close to 100%, but one is delivering a dose 5 to 10 to 20 times higher. Sativex is approved in 27 nations. It's a ratio of THC to CBD for multiple sclerosis. And Epidiolex, which is a pure form of CBDs in phase 3 clinical trials in the US. And so far the data look very promising. What about safety? I think that this is a critical issue. The risks versus the benefits, said the defense. Any psychoactive drug has potential negative and positive effects. The potential benefits outweigh the risks, and we should reschedule marijuana as a Schedule 2. And if you don't like smoking, we can use vaporizers or edibles. They said traffic fatalities or accidents, there's no relationship between marijuana use and fatalities. Only 9% of people meet criteria. Yes, there is reports of a loss of IQ, but it's in the normal range. The evidence for amotivation is lacking, productivity. There's no meaningful or consistent impact. And brain changes, oh, there are lots of brain changes, but everything changes our brain. You play Tetris, your brain changes. You read a book, your brain changes. Who cares about brain changes? The association between marijuana use and mental illness is not causation. It may cause the onset of mental illness, but there's no increase worldwide in schizophrenia. And it's so important because it's been successfully used to treat anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Every piece of literature I've read on this issue, the latter one, is that it makes things worse eventually. So what do the governments say? Well, let's summarize it. Acute effects: IQ, motivation, psychosis, function, and safety. And none of us can predict with a crystal ball who will or who will not get affected. But we do know that the probabilities increase for certain incidents and prevalence of diseases. Marijuana intoxication impairs higher brain function. There's so many studies on this. The list is very long. I won't give you the references, they're in my notes if anyone wants them. It impairs learning and working memory. It reduces attention span. It reduces judgment, reaction time, organizational and planning ability, problem solving, decision making, perception of facts, times, emotional control, behavioral control, motor coordination, increases impulsivity, increases appetite, dry mouth, heart rate, increases anxiety or agitation, suspiciousness or paranoia, if there's enough. And of course, it increases euphoria and disinhibition, which is the primary reason for using it. But all of these things can have the downside. It's a hazard, so what are some of the scientific questions regarded? There's no level of impairment that is scientifically established. There's no non-invasive tests, as Marilyn West has said so eloquently yesterday, to define impairment. And arbitrary THC cutoffs in body fluids don't correlate with impairment. So what happens after long-term use? This is a weird shape. It's actually the shape of a nerve cell, the core, the cell body, without its connections. And you can see their purple dots. The purple dots are very dense. They are distributed on the outer layer. After long-term cannabis use in humans, this is Dudok et al., using a new type of brain imaging what he found, this is on nanoscale measurements, that the purple dots, which are the cannabinoid receptors, decrease. They decrease and they move inside the cell. They're no longer distributed on the outside, they're no longer available for endocannabinoids, which gives rise to impaired learning, higher stress, higher negative mood, more drug craving, and so on. These are some of the long-term effects. It degrades brain function. It impairs learning and memory, motor function, balance, coordination. It impairs decision-making. These are the brain regions most affected. Now, the only reason I use this guy is because he has publicly stated he has not used drugs. So I hope I'm on safe legal territory. But this was a longitudinal study. That was the Dunedin study. Madeline Meyer from the United States excavated the data. It was started at the age of 13. It went until the age of 38. And she found that IQ did drop. It dropped most if you used before age 18 and kept using heavily to the point of addiction at 38. IQ drop was associated with how much time you used and how heavily you used. It was still reduced if you used before age 18 and then quit. And it was still reduced if you kept on using until 38. So what does it mean? You drop 9 points. If you're an average IQ of 100, half the population has an IQ above you, half the population has an IQ below you. That's called the 50th percentile. You drop 8 points, 70% of the population now has a higher IQ than you, and 30% are below. Now, if you start at 90 and you drop 8 points, you're beginning to fall into the range where you are less capable of taking care of yourself. Longitudinal studies started very young and continued for a very long period of time with a huge number of people. The more you use, starting from never to 400 times during teenagehood, the much less likely to graduate from college, the much more likely to be on welfare and unemployed. A different study by a different person. Much more likely, if you use daily, to become addicted, to use other illicit drugs, suicide attempt, and much less likely to complete high school or college degree. How does this happen? This so-called amotivation. So somebody just published this, very interesting, in JAMA Psychiatry, which is a very rigorous journal. They put people into a game setting and compared non-marijuana, long-time non-marijuana users with marijuana users. And they used money as an incentive. And what they found is that for non-users, if they presented the money, their dopamine levels, which is a chemical message that's involved in sensing reward, went way up, and their nucleus accumbens, which is considered one of the reward centers of the brain, lit up like fire. The people who were heavy cannabis users, their dopamine levels did not increase, and their nucleus accumbens wasn't activated. So the blunted response of a brain region anticipating monetary rewards was found in the cannabis users, the heavy ones, and not in others. And alcohol, people who had heavy alcohol use did not show the same thing. The amotivation appeared to be specific to marijuana and not to alcohol, which could drive compulsive use, vulnerability to addiction, and amotivation. So let's just summarize. Long-term heavy marijuana use is associated with educational underachievement, impaired motivation, poorer functional outcomes, higher rates of welfare dependency, lower income, correlated with age of onset of use, a number of times used. Is marijuana the cause, the consequence, or just a correlate of reduced motivation? What is becoming more and more prominent is that the longitudinal studies, which means you start before children begin to use at 13, they show that the amount you use is a function of how poorly you function as an adult. And it implicates marijuana, doesn't prove it, but it implicates it as a causative agent. And it's critical from the perspective of public policy. What about psychosis? Early marijuana adolescent use is associated with psychosis in young adulthood. You start before age 15, the risk goes way up for schizophrenia and for psychosis. The strength and frequency of use increases the risk. You never use, skunk is 16%, hash is 4%, and if you use daily, the risk increases. The strength and frequency of marijuana use lowers the age when psychosis appears. Now, Miley is photographed smoking marijuana, so I don't feel that her lawyers will come after me. But this is, if you use daily, very potent use, the age at which schizophrenia appears is reduced. If adolescents use marijuana weekly for 1 to 2 years, compared to 3 years, compared to 4 years, they have a higher incidence of bizarre thoughts, a higher incidence of paranoid thoughts, higher incidence of hallucinations, and a higher incidence of subclinical psychosis, all dependent on how many years they've used weekly. So, adolescents are likelier, after years of regular use, to have subclinical psychotic symptoms. They persist after using for a year, and they increase the risk of future subclinical psychosis and hallucinations. Marijuana use disorder, people who have a marijuana use disorder, their association with other significant mental disorders is very high, including other drug use disorders, bipolar, borderline, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizotypal, antisocial behavior, major depression, anxiety, and so on. This is a profound issue. And there are more hospitalizations with people with mental illness who use. There's more compulsory admissions in hospitals for people with mental illness who use marijuana, and also the number of days spent in a hospital. Marijuana use increases the relapse. If you use frequently, you have a much more likely chance of relapsing to psychosis, much more likely chance of having more relapses, and the length of the relapse is longer. So it appears to be a preventable risk factor for psychosis. It can cause acute, transient, dose-dependent psychosis. It's implicated as a direct causative agent. It's not necessary or sufficient to develop schizophrenia, but it appears to trigger psychosis and schizophrenia in vulnerable people. The use precedes psychosis independent of alcohol or other drugs, and the poor outcomes if marijuana is continuously used after the first episode. Every used marijuana increase risk of 2-fold, and frequent use increase of risk is 6-fold. What about children and marijuana? During pregnancy, during adolescence, and before conception. So, the brain is a magnificent organ, magnificent. Out of a single cell, many cells begin to hook up. And from one cell, you get 100 billion cells. It's as if there are 100 billion telephones in this room, and each one has a few to thousands of connections. The endocannabinoids in your brain are critical for brain development. They promote the birth of new brain cells, they tell the cells what type to become, they guide them to their targets. And can marijuana interfere with normal brain development? 72% of pregnant teens in rehab use marijuana. Endocannabinoids, I've just said, they promote many facets of brain development. And THC reorganizes wires in the developing brain. It changes the circuitry. It disrupts development. It disrupts maintenance of connections. And some of these changes have been found not only in animal models, but in post-mortem fetal brain. So in the fetus, there's potential for infertility, placental problems, and low birth weight. There's increased tremor and startle at 9 months. There's some evidence for impaired mental development. 3 to 6 years, the manifestations are inattention, impulsivity, and between 14 and 21 years, there's a risk of smoking, an increased risk of smoking marijuana and other brain functions. The teen brain is changing rapidly. I won't get into this except to say that it prunes unneeded connections, it grows in size, it wires cortical dopamine circuits, it strengthens connections. And most brain disorders start during adolescence because the brain is undergoing its most rapid development. So is marijuana safe for youth? Every adversity associated with marijuana use is worse for adolescent or younger initiates. Addiction to other drugs, poisoning, brain changes, IQ loss, poor grades at school, psychosis. These are just a summary. 42 studies have shown that marijuana changes the adolescent brain, and these are different regions of the brain where the changes are found. This is my own research, I won't dwell on it. But long-term marijuana use is associated with adverse effects on brain and body in all these categories. Zach began using marijuana at grade 7. What about preconception? This is only done in rats. We don't know if it will work in humans. We don't know if it applies to humans. But a male and female rat are exposed to THC in adolescence. They're allowed to grow up without it, so they never see it again. Never. They mate. They never see THC again. The female gives rise to babies. The babies mature. Babies have never seen THC because their bodies were analyzed and their parents' bodies were analyzed for THC. And what was found is that the babies seek heroin more, their behaviors are different, and their brains are different in the reward region. So there is a concept that epigenetics is involved in this. The defense, qualified experts accept marijuana. Polls would show that the majority of physicians overwhelmingly support or feel that cannabis has medical benefit. It might have efficacy. It's accepted by qualified experts. The American Academy of Neurology said the government not sufficient to make definite conclusions. There's no current scientific evidence that marijuana is beneficial for the treatment of psychiatric disorders. The American Academy of Ophthalmology, I can go on and on, there's 7 or 8 different medical associations that do not endorse whole plant marijuana. So the chemistry is not known, evidence of safety is weak, efficacy is weak, qualified experts do not agree, and so the federal government said, these are the 3 criteria that should stay in Schedule 1. Judge Kimberly Mueller wrote the decision. This is not the court, this is not the time. The court denies the motion, and the verdict is that marijuana stays in Schedule 1. Chuck Rosenberg, the acting DEA administrator, reiterated that decision August 11th of this year. He said, does not have currently accepted medical use, lack of accepted safety, high potential for abuse, and it remains in Schedule 1. This is the World Health Organization report. You can see it. I'm wrapping up right now, and I'm still within the time. Parents have enormous positive influence. This is not known by many people. The NISDA data show that if parents do not approve of using marijuana or cigarettes, but 5% of the children use. If parents don't show strong disapproval, or if they use themselves or make no statements, 35% of kids use. 7-fold difference, folks. That's huge. Now, they can have a very positive influence. They can also have a remarkably negative influence. Parents with marijuana use disorders can have an enormous negative influence on child's violence and suicide attempts. Surprisingly, to these investigators, these were over 1 million children, a million families, they found that a cannabis use disorder among parents, the child was much more likely to have a violent offense, and alcohol was not anywhere close to the risk of a parent with cannabis use disorder. A child had a much higher probability of attempting suicide in a household with a parent with cannabis use disorder, higher than alcohol. So I close by saying we are in a battle now for individual rights, one of which is to make windfall profits and the greater good, the public health good. And so what we are weighing now is full access. Proponents, advocates say it's safe, it's pleasure, it's victimless, civil right. Only a plant, beneficial, alcohol worse, no addiction. Patients are suffering, the FDA is cumbersome, it's difficult to patent, it's a cheap alternative. And on the other side, it's unsafe, there's no accountability, it circumvents the Food and Drug Administration, it's a public health issue. It impairs function, it can cause addiction, it has negative health, psychiatric, behavioral, brain effects. Adolescents are particularly at risk, parents and their children at risk, and public safety is of primary concern. I do think the scientific evidence will prevail. These are some of my heroes in this past and present world. And I conclude by saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a war on drugs. This is a defense of this one 3-pound organ in our brain that we honor more than any other part of our body because it is the repository of our humanity. The humanity that enables us to develop theater, philosophy, music, calculus, poetry, laws, iPhones, medications, magnificent laws of physics, 3D printing, conjure up and understand DNA, send the New Horizons rocket to Pluto 3 billion miles away and hit it in the bullseye. And of course, understand and conjure up galaxies and black holes. And one of the greatest epicenters of brain power in the world, Silicon Valley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madras, for that wonderful conclusion as well. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, so that we need to move on, but they will be answered by Dr. Madras during the break or later on, and we'll also send all any questions you may have out on the Eventbrite as well.